Peter Griffin, the heart of Family Guy, has come a long way, though not in the direction you'd expect. Once a bumbling but lovable father who meant well, Peter has transformed into a character defined by chaos, selfishness, and destruction. Somehow, a man meant to represent family now often feels like the least family-oriented character in the show. Time magazine even listed him among their top 10 worst fictional fathers, calling him a ripoff of Homer Simpson, who took the bad dad archetype and cranked it up to 11. But how did Peter Griffin go from a relatable everyman to someone his own kids are terrified of? And what does that say about the evolution of Family Guy itself? Let's dive in.
Giggity, 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 giggity.
Not you, Quagmire. Alright, in the earliest seasons of Family Guy, Peter Griffin truly felt like the Family Guy the show's title promised. Sure, he was clumsy, short-sighted, and often caused more problems than he solved, but beneath it all, he had a good heart. Peter wasn't just a caricature of a sitcom dad, he was someone trying his best, even if his best wasn't all that great. Take his relationship with Lois in the early days. Peter often messed up, but he genuinely cared. In Death is a Bitch, after ditching their anniversary to golf, he went to extreme lengths to serenade Lois with Peter Frampton, courtesy of the Grim Reaper himself. And there's also the Mob episode where Peter, well, I'll let him explain it.
So I was talking to Big Fat Paulie the other day, and one thing led to another, and I sort of put a hit out on you.
He then puts his life on the line to save Lois from a hit by offering himself up to the mob boss instead. So yeah, Peter was a guy willing to sacrifice himself for his family, so no matter how ridiculous he was, made him kinda embarrassing. Peter's parenting had its shining moments too.
I made you, and I can destroy you. God damn, they must have put it in the wrong baby.
Okay, not all moments are great. However, in the same episode, he actually encouraged Chris's passion for art, even when others were doubting and mocking him, proving that he could be supportive when it mattered. Peter wasn't just a solid, if flawed family man, he was also a loyal friend. Okay, maybe talking about the Cleveland show might be cheating, but hey, my show, my rules. You can pack up and leave if you don't like it. Kidding, please don't click off the videos. I need the views and I love you there. Anyway, in the first season of the Cleveland show, Peter stepped up for Cleveland, defending him from a gang of rednecks with more courage than brains. The point here is, Peter's friendships with Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe felt genuine back in the days, forming the backbone of the show's humor and heart. What set early Peter apart was that, despite his frequent bumbling, his intentions were good. He wasn't a perfect husband, father, or friend, far from it, but his humanity shone through. He wasn't just chaos incarnate, he was chaos tempered by love and sincerity. However, as the seasons progressed, this balance began to shift. Peter's well-meaning but misguided antics morphed into something much darker. The guy who once sang Peter Frampton to win back Lois started to care less about his family and more about his own whims. And as the show leaned harder into shock value, Peter's value were magnified tenfold. What happened to the Peter Griffin who could, at least occasionally, rise to the moment? The Peter Griffin we met in the early seasons, while imperfect, at least cared about his family. But over time, that lovable fool gave way to someone much harder to root for. His flaws, once endearing and funny, started evolving into outright cruelty. The decline wasn't sudden, but it was unmistakable. Take the episode where Stewie gets hooked on steroids, for instance. When Lois felt insecure about her age, Peter made the situation exponentially worse by publicly humiliating her at her own birthday party. Instead of offering her comfort or reassurance, he stood in front of her friends and neighbors and compared her to a reliable old plow horse. What started as a playful teasing in earlier seasons became a pattern of emotional abuse, and Lois was often the target. Then there's the Peter's treatment of his kids. In Seahorse Seashell Party, one of the trippiest episodes in Family Guy history, Peter is confronted for treating Meg like crap her entire life, barely being able to provide for his family, and even eating Chris's yogurts on purpose.
You eat all my Dannon yogurts!
I don't see your name on him.
You don't even like them, but you know I do, and you don't want me to have them!
Bully move, Peter, bully move. And these weren't isolated incidents. Peter's behavior, which used to be lighthearted and silly, but became outright malicious. In Brian Griffin's House of Pain, when Meg and Chris accidentally injured Stewie, Peter went so far as to frame Lois by planting Stewie's unconscious body under her car. Instead of stepping up as a father and taking responsibility, he put his wife in a position of guilt and despair, all for a laugh. This wasn't the same Peter who sang to Lois under the stars or went on vision quests with his kids. This was someone darker. The decline was undeniable, and Peter Griffin was no longer just a flawed family guy, he was turning into the show's biggest antagonist. As Peter's treatment of his family worsened, his antics began crossing into outright violence, turning him from a lovable oaf into a dangerous liability. This wasn't just about slapstick comedy anymore, it was something far darker. Over time, Peter's increasingly violent tendencies tendencies became a running theme, with a staggering kill count being one of the show's most bizarre developments. For instance, in Passenger Fatty 7, we've seen Peter's reckless behavior leading to the accidental bombing of a children's hospital. The show played it for laughs, but from a character standpoint, it was hard to ignore just how far Peter had spiraled from the relatively harmless troublemaker he was. What made these situations even more unsettling was Peter's lack of remorse. His violence wasn't confined to strangers or gags, it was extended to his own family. In Baby It's Cold Inside, Peter left Lois to fend for herself in shark-infested waters, all while fleeing to safety. Sure, it turned to be a friendly dolphin, and 2, this made it painfully clear that Peter no longer represented the family guy he once was, transforming instead into a man who endangered those closest to him for selfish gain. But okay, I'm not gonna be so dramatic. This was a humorous show. The writers decided to make the humor darker, a lot darker, so the audience couldn't help but to laugh and cringe at the same time. There's the running joke of Peter having, let's just say, questionable content on his laptop. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure that one out. The gag was, even though I'm not a fan of this expression, but I'll just say it, edgy, but it worked. Over time, we learned to respect these jokes from Family Guy. The only thing is, Peter's character developed, or regressed depending on how you view it, even further. He went from a clueless dad to a guy who can say and do pretty much anything. Is there a line? For Peter Griffin, I think there's no line anymore. He's just wildcard at this point. And let's not forget Peter's kill count, which somehow just keeps climbing. There's blowing up a children's hospital, murdering Yogi Bear, or ripping faces off townspeople in a Scooby-Doo style investigation. It's like the writers decided, you know what, let's turn Peter into a full-blown lunatic and see how far we can push it. Now, it's hard not to appreciate the irony of a show called Family Guy when the guy at its center seems to care less about his family. In the early seasons, Peter might have been clumsy and dim-witted, but at least he tried. He cared even if his efforts went sideways. Fast forward to the later seasons, and it's like Peter traded in those family values for gags that prioritize shock over substance. Take Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, for instance. Meg is bedridden with the mumps, and Peter, in true dad fashion, shows up in a full 19th century diving suit so he wouldn't get the disease himself. Thankfully, Stewie gets him for the viewers.
Chris, check it out. Jackass #2.
You can't really call that parenting, can you? Early Family Guy episodes found their humor in the dynamics of the Griffin household. Sure, things got absurd, but the family was still at their heart of it all. Now, the family almost feels like an afterthought, a backdrop for Peter's latest over-the-top antics. Contrast that with the Peter Griffin of the early seasons, who at least had a little bit of self-awareness and loyalty to his family. He once surprised Stewie with a trip to Disney World to make up for being a bad dad. But as the seasons went on, that Peter disappeared, replaced by someone who not only neglects his family, but outright exploits them. The shift in tone isn't subtle. Somewhere along the way, Family Guy stopped being about a dysfunctional family trying to stick together and became a platform for increasingly outrageous and, let's be honest, disconnected humor. And that brings us back to the title, Family Guy. The show that began as a satire about a bumbling but ultimately caring dad trying to navigate life with his family has turned into a show where family seems more like a punchline than a theme. It begs the question, is Peter Griffin even the family guy the title once promised, or has he become the very antithesis of it? Let's be real, Peter Griffin probably won't be winning Dad of the Year anytime soon, but every so often he gives us a glimmer of hope. You know, just enough to make us think, wait, maybe he's not completely irredeemable. Like when he actually remembers he has a family and does something shockingly sweet. Well, sweet for Peter. In Road to the Multiverse, another episode I've already covered in the Trippiest Episodes video, which you should definitely watch, Peter uses the trip to the last blockbuster to bond with his family, instead, you know, using it to torment Meg or ruin someone's day. Or how about Brief Encounter, where Peter decides to spice things up in his marriage? Sure, his idea of effort involves some questionable role play, but hey, at least he's trying.
Hey, Brian, now can you strap me to this milking table? My wife will be home soon.
Lois seems into it, so who are we to judge? The guy might mess up 99% of the time, but every now and then he stumbles into a moment that's almost, dare I say it, heartwarming. Is it enough to undo decades of being a disaster? Absolutely not, but hey, even Peter Griffin has his moments. Tiny, fleeting moments, emphasis on tiny. Peter, although inspired by security guard Seth MacFarlane knew back at the Rhode Island School of Design, was kinda Homer light. He was the goofy, bumbling dad with a heart buried somewhere under his cluelessness and bad decisions. Sure, he'd mess up a lot, but deep down, you knew his intentions were good. Fast forward 2 decades and Peter Griffin has become the poster child for unhinged cartoon dads. He's no longer just lazy or oblivious, he's selfish, cruel, and sometimes outright dangerous, and yet somehow the show still revolves around him. The irony of Family Guy is impossible to ignore. How did a character who once tried to protect his family at all costs become someone who routinely sabotages them for a laugh? It's a question that defines not only Peter's character arc, but the show as a whole. While Peter's chaos has brought some of the most outrageous comedy in TV history, it's also left many wondering, has he gone too far? But hey, that's what keeps us watching, right? Peter's paradox is what makes Family Guy so unique. It's a show that thrives on unpredictability, pushing boundaries, and let's face it, making us laugh at things we probably shouldn't. Oh, and while we're diving into chaos, don't miss our deep dive into the Quagmire paradox. Glenn Quagmire has gone from a one-note giggity machine to one of the most unexpectedly complex characters in the series. Okay, now it's fine. Do it, Glenn.
Giggity, 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 ooh, ee, ooh, ah, ah, ting, tang, walla, walla, bing, bang, ooh, ee, ooh, ah, ah, ting, tang, walla, walla, bing, bang.